Okay, I'll start again. So today is the 18th day of Elul, the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov, and therefore it's worth contemplating a bit, thinking about what the Baal Shem Tov brought into the world. What was the chidush, the new thing, the novelty of the Baal Shem Tov? Every now and then, a great soul comes down into the world and changes the world for the better. This doesn't happen on a daily basis, obviously. It only happens on rare occasions. And if we trace what is called the Shalshelet Kabbalah, the chain of receiving of the inner dimension of the Torah, so really we would go back probably all the way. I mean, besides what was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses, but in the later generations, the last 2,000 years, after the time of the Nevi'im, after all the prophets, all the whole prophetic era. So we come to a period in which the great sages of the Talmud, the Talmudic sages, began their teachings. There were plenty of Kabbalistic teachings before that. There are books that are attributed to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses, to Abraham. It's called Sefer Yetzirah, Abraham, and so on. But if we start from the last 2,000 years, so the greatest figure in Kabbalistic thought, in fact, the author of the, so to speak, Bible of Kabbalistic thought, the Bible of Kabbalah, so to speak, the Zohar. So the author of that was Rabbi Shimon bar Yohai. And he lived at the time of approximately the time of the end of the Second Temple, the destruction of the Second Temple, just after that. That's when he lived. And he was living under Roman persecution. He had to run away from the Romans and hide away in a cave. And much of the Zohar was composed while he was hiding away. And that was a monumental work. The Zohar was a monumental work of tremendous insights and things that had not really been revealed except to exceptional people before then. Also, the whole methodology of the Zohar was very different from the methodology, let's say, of Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah is very enigmatic. The Zohar precisely comes to explain the enigmas. Yes, it increases secrets as well. It doesn't subtract from them in any way. But the ideas that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai brought into the world became the grist for the mill of Kabbalistic analysis and discovery until today. So there was Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was one of those souls that changed the whole way of thinking, as did Rabbi Yitzhak Luria. The entire tradition from the Zohar, from the writing of the Zohar onwards, it was hidden for many, many years, and it was only discovered in about the 1300s again. So the entire the fuel for Kabbalistic thought in that era was partially the hidden teachings of the Zohar, and partially other teachings. But when after they were discovered in about the 1300s, the next greatest, very great sage was, as you probably know, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria the Arizal in the 1500s. Now, if we compare the Zohar's teachings and his teachings, there are those that have compared it to, although I don't think it's a fair analogy, and I'll explain why in a minute, but there are those who compare the teachings of the Zohar like to the science of Newton. Whereas the Arizal is much more like relativity, Einsteinian physics, so to speak. Now, I don't think it's a fair comparison from the point of view that all that Rabbi Yitzhak Luria brings out, he brings out from the Zohar. Not that it wasn't there before. It was in the Zohar, just it wasn't understood. And he brought it to light. So it was there implicitly, but he brought it out explicitly. And if we would talk about the era of the Zohar, so, for that 1,500 years until the advent of the Arizal, so the primary analysis of Kabbalah was to understand the origins of being, the origins of existence, the origins of life in this world. And not only the origins, but mapping out the entire, so to speak, universe of causes and effects to be able to understand how it is that we got to where we are. That was what the Zohar was all about. There's plenty of other stuff in the Zohar as well, plenty of ideas which have to do with prophecy and divine inspiration and so on and so forth. But the primary thrust of the Zohar was to understand the creation of existence, how existence came into being. Along came the Arizal, and his primary focus was not how existence came into being, but sort of the interactive aspects of existence. How do various parts of reality interact with each other and strengthen, or in some cases cancel each other? How do they interact? The interactions of various spiritual forces was what interested the Arizal, not so much the historical developmental aspect that was previously brought out of the Zohar, but much more the interactive and ongoing relationship aspects of the spiritual forces that were mentioned in the Zohar. If the first era was called Hishtalshalut meaning the chaining down of being, or the great chain of being, so the second era of Kabbalah, the era of the Arizal, that era was called the era of Hitlavshut. Hitlavshut meaning the entering clothing of one aspect in the other, like one aspect being clothed in another one, and the interactions that result from these interactions. Then along came the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov revealed a completely new facet in Kabbalah, in Kabbalistic thinking, and that was the facet that is called Hasha. Hasha means the indwelling of the divine presence, or if actually in some senses more correctly, the ondwelling of the divine presence on individuals and on creation. Why do you say ondwelling? Because it's not something that's necessarily grasped in it's not something that's grasped within the vessel of the recipient. It's much more enveloped thereby rather than grasped thereby, which is called Hashra'ah. Hashra'ah also means inspiration. It means dwelling upon and inspiration. In other words, the dwelling upon of godliness on the world and how that works and how we can bring that about, and also the inspiration of the individual to be to live an inspired life. That inspiration is a type of motivation that, in a sense, constantly feeds itself, whereas motivation is just until you get a single task done, or a particular goal accomplished. You're motivated towards a certain goal. Inspiration is not something that comes outside of yourself. It's something that's within you. It's not motivation can come from outside sources as well. But inspiration comes from an inner wellspring, so to speak. And that inner wellspring of inspiration can and ought to light up a person's life until it becomes a source of living waters, so to speak. Now, that's the idea of a source of living waters is spoken about in the Mishnah. The Torah uses the concept of living waters. There's certain types of spiritual impurity that need to be purified by the highest level of purification, which is called immersion in the living waters. There's immersion in what is called a mikveh. A mikveh is a pool of water. And then there's immersion in a a stream of living water. In other words, water that's gushing out from a source, usually a source deep underground, and that source never dries up. According to the Mishnah, it doesn't dry up, not even once in 7 years. You could, of course, ask the question, so what if it dries up? Right now, the water's running. Why is that not good for purification? And the answer is that if it dries up, even once in 7 years, it's not called living water. Living water means something that's alive and something that's connected. A mikveh is water that is not connected. It's only connected to its, a mikveh meaning a pool of water, it's only connected to its, to a single static source that feeds it, but it's not connected to the source of all things, to the source of water underneath the earth. Let me just explain what I mean for a second, and then we will understand much more where the Baal Shem Tov is coming from. There is what is called the cycle of water. The water cycle, the way it's understood in Kabbalah as an analogy, it's understood as a very important analogy. In fact, the Torah itself is called water. The Torah is called Mayim Chaim, living water. And it's explained like this. The rain falls to the earth and wets the fields and so on and so forth, and waters the forests and the fields and so on. That everyone knows about. However, the water that we get, let's say the water in a reservoir, the water in a pond, or the water in a lake, or the water in the sea, like where does that come from? What connects that? So the Kabbalah speaks about the source of water underground is called the Tohom Rabbah. Let me just write that. I'll write it in English here. Okay, Tohom Rabbah, or in Hebrew. I'm writing this in the chat. Tohom Rabbah, right? The Tohom Rabbah means the vast reservoir of water underneath the earth. So that vast reservoir of water underneath the earth is understood to be like the source from where all things flow. It corresponds in the Sfirot, it corresponds to Keter, the first of the Sfirot. Then the water comes out through various channels from the underground, from deep underground, the water comes out through various channels, and it sort of spurts out in a kind of a fountain or a spring. That spring is analogous to Chokhmah, the second of the Sfirot. It doesn't flow out so much as it sort of spurts out, just like Chokhmah doesn't flow out, flow into existence. It suddenly appears and disappears and appears and disappears in a state of constant flux, a state of constant coming into being and receding into nothingness. Nothingness being the source of being, which is not understood, therefore it's called nothingness. Not that it isn't there, it's there. It's there much more than we're here, but it just is called nothingness because it can't be comprehended and it can't be described and defined. Therefore it cannot be comprehended. So that's Chokhmah. Then the river that flows out from the spring, as the spring sort of bubbles up from under the ground, it forms a river, right? And the river flows down and eventually is gathered together in kind of a lake or a sea, right? So the river represents Bina, and the sea represents Malchut. So we have the whole origin of sort of the source of water, from the source of water deep underground until the sea or the large lake, which is fed ultimately by this spring, which is fed ultimately by the water that is deep underground, and that represents the various sfirot. So water that flows out of the ground like that, and if it flows constantly, that's called Mayim Chaim. That's called living water. Why? It's water that's connected and always connected to its source. It's water that's connected to the source. Water in the pool further down the road, further down the line, may not be connected to its source any longer. If it's a certain amount of water, it can purify. But only water that's connected to the source can purify a person from what's called Tumat Meit, the impurity of death. If one came into contact with a dead body, one needs a purification in mayim chaim, in water that's called mayim chaim. There's other things one needs as well, the ash of the red heifer, which we don't have today, but in any event, that is the highest level of purification, the level of purification of living water. Now, that idea of living water is the same idea as Hashra'ah. Hashra'ah being inspiration, being divinely inspired from within. In other words, the flow is there, the water is flowing out of its deep channels connected with the ultimate source of all being, or the ultimate source of all water, the water underneath the earth, which would be Keter. Ultimately connected, the individual is connected with the source of his soul up above, which is obviously the source of the soul is in God, right? The source of the soul being in God. So, what the Baal Shem Tov did, what the Baal Shem Tov was able to do, was to ignite this inspiration in other people in ways that had never been in ways that had never been done before. The way that it was done until the time of the Baal Shem Tov essentially was through study and through prayer, but primarily through study. The Baal Shem Tov showed that even very simple people, even people who are not learned and people who are not great scholars, also have this wellspring inside of them, and it can be revealed. And he spent much of his time, particularly during the time that he was traveling usually with his students, tapping into those well springs within individuals who are not necessarily recognized as great, and showing them the source of living water within them. And once they could tap into that, once people understood how to tap into that, they became transformed individuals, transformed into something completely different from what they were before. Now, all of this was greatly enhanced by an experience that the Baal Shem Tov had in the year Taf Kuf Zayin. Taf Kuf Zayin will be about 1607, as far as I'm aware. If someone can correct me, they're welcome to do so. No, it would be 1707, I think. Yes? Is that correct? Yeah, 1707. Anyway, it's not really that important. The Hebrew date is Tav Kuf Zayin, and the day was the day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, less than a couple of weeks. So the Baal Shem Tov writes in a letter to his brother-in-law about the experience that he had on the Jewish New Year of the year Tav Kuf Zayin. Tav Kuf Zayin. And this is what he writes to him. He says basically he had what is called, he did various things that were necessary to have what is called an aliyat neshama. An aliyat neshama means an ascent of soul. His soul ascended very, very high. Higher than it had ever before. And he says, I saw things, amazing things that I had never ever seen before, since the day that he gained knowledge. This is a letter that he's writing to his brother-in-law. Since the day that I gained knowledge, I had never seen these things before, and things that I can't even tell you. Even if I was here, his brother-in-law was at that time living in Israel, and he said, I can't tell you. Even if you would be standing in my presence, we were standing together, I would not be able to explain it to you, because it was so lofty and so elevated and so amazing. Now, when he came, he says, when I returned to the lower Garden of Eden, there's a higher Garden of Eden and the lower Garden of Eden. The lower Garden of Eden is usually the world of Yetzirah. The higher Garden of Eden is usually the world of Bria, but not necessarily. The higher Garden of Eden could be the world of Atzilut, and the lower Garden of Eden could be the world of Bria. In any event, the Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at of any world are called the Gan Eden of that world. So there are 4 worlds, and each world has its own Gan Eden, its own Garden of Eden. And even the world of Adam Kadmon could be said to have a Garden of Eden, which would be Chokhmah and Bina of Ak, of Adam Kadmon. In any event, whatever the upper Gan Eden is for the Baal Shem Tov, I would assume it's the world of Atzilut. So he said, when I return to the lower Gan Eden, which is the world of Bria, I saw a number of souls over there, who souls of living people, and people who had already passed away. Some were known to me, some were not known to me. And it's interesting to note that he saw the souls of people whom he knew that were even living in the world. In other words, a person does not have to be dead to be in Gan Eden. You don't have to die to go to the Garden of Eden. This is a fallacy. A person could be in that state of spiritual ecstasy when they're alive in this world. In any event, he says that all the souls in the Garden of Eden begged him to ascend with them. In other words, to use his powers to ascend, and they would ascend together with him. He would be able to lift them up from the lower Garden of Eden to the upper Garden of Eden, to the very highest levels. And although he knew that he could do that, he was afraid to do it on his own dot, on his own authority. So he asked his teacher to come with him. Who was the teacher of the Baal Shem Tov? The teacher of the Baal Shem Tov was the prophet Achia Hashiloni. Achia Hashiloni lived at the time of the prophet Elijah. And there are those that say that Achia Hashiloni was in fact the teacher. I'm just going to switch some windows over here. Sorry, it's getting unstable here. All right, whatever. All right, never mind. Let me just close a few windows here. Okay, good. All right, so again, the teacher of the Baal Shem Tov, Achia Shiloni, according to many opinions, he was the teacher of Elijah, the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi. Some say he was a student of Eliyahu Hanavi. He was a student of Elijah. But most opinions are that he was the teacher of Elijah, and he lasted from the time of Elijah all the way through to the time of King David. He lived a very, very, very long life, 400 years, more than 400 years. In any event, the soul of that prophet was the teacher of the Baal Shem Tov, and he was known, Achia Shiloni is known as the keeper of the secrets. He's the one that has the secrets of the Torah. He has the keys to the secrets, and he was the teacher, the spiritual guide, the spiritual teacher of the Baal Shem Tov. So when the Baal Shem Tov wanted to go to the very, very highest levels, he asked his teacher to go with him, the soul of his teacher to go with him, because he didn't want to go on his own. He was afraid to go on his own. Why was he afraid? Because, as he says during this letter, he didn't know whether he was alive or dead anymore. He didn't know whether he had died, and that's why when they greeted him with great joy, he thought that maybe he had died and left the world, and he was now going to be permanently in the Garden of Eden, and that's why everyone was so joyous that he would now be there. He later discovered that he hadn't yet died, but he wasn't aware. He didn't know whether he was alive or dead. Anyway, so he goes up through the pillar. There's something called the Amud, or the pillar between the lower Garden of Eden, the lower Garden of Eden, and the higher Garden of Eden. And he ascends to the very highest level of the upper Garden of Eden, the Garden of Eden of the world of Atzilut. And there he goes into the chamber of Mashiach, chamber of the Messiah, who's learning with all of the prophets and all of the great sages. They're studying together. And he asks Mashiach, he asks the Messiah, when are you coming? When are you coming? And he said like this, I will come, and now I'm going to put on the, I'm going to share screen, just a second here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so there's 4 stages of the revelation of essentially the Messianic Era, or the revelation of Mashiach or Messiah, the revelation of how we will know that it's now the Messianic era, that it's now the time, the Messianic time. And it basically follows these 4 steps. This is what is told to him this is what the Baal Shem Tov tells in his letter to his brother-in-law that he was told. And it goes like this: when your teachings or your methods will become known and revealed in the world, when the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov will become known and revealed in the world. That's the first stage. Let's call it 4 stages rather than periods. 4 stages, the stages of development. I'm going to change that if you don't mind, for accuracy's sake. 4 stages of development. Okay. So the first again is your teachings or your methods will become known and revealed in the world. In other words, that the teachings that the Baal Shem Tov was going to reveal to the world, the teachings that he himself received from his teacher, the secret teachings of the Torah, the teachings, the inspirational teachings which wake a person up from within inside, they bring him back to life, so to speak. The Baal Shem Tov says elsewhere that the world, when the Baal Shem Tov came into the world had just suffered through, the Jewish world had just suffered through tremendous difficulties. Times of huge pogroms, the Chemoniki riots, which in Russia claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. And some of the greatest sages of the time were decimated by Chemoniki. He was a Cossack, and he would go around just destroying villages and setting them on fire and killing men, women, and children left and right. It was terrible, terrible times. And the world was very discouraged and was in a state, in fact, of spiritual fainting. Hitalfut. It's more than just fainting, it's a coma. The world was in a spiritual coma at that time. The entire world was in a spiritual coma, including the Jewish world, in a spiritual coma. So along came the Baal Shem Tov, and he whispered in the ear of the fainting child, so to speak. Actually, the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe Chabad, brings an analogy. He says as follows. He says the teachings of Hasidus were like a medicine for a child who was extremely sick, and his father was the king. This was the prince, and he was the crown prince. He would have been the prince if he survived. He would be the prince. But he got very, very, very ill, and so ill that all the doctors gave up on helping him. All the doctors had given up on him. Until one sage came along and he said, there is a way to cure this boy, but it's going to demand a tremendous amount of self-sacrifice from the king. What's that self-sacrifice? The king asked. The crown jewel, your crown jewel, the beauty and the glory of your crown has to be crushed into a powder and administered to the prince little by little with some water, in order to make it palatable, that he'll be able to swallow just a little, even a little bit will help him. But most of it will go to waste. Most of it he won't be able to absorb, and most of it it's going to be just ground down to dust, and it's going to be, your crown jewel will be ground down to dust. But it has to be done. And the king said, go ahead and do it. So those were the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. That's the way it's explained. One of the Rebbes of Chabad later on explained that that's exactly what it was. Those teachings were the crown jewel. They'd never been revealed in the world before. They were now crushed and administered with water given to the Baal Shem Tov to give over to the people, right? Which would give life, bring life back to the prince, bring life back to a people and a world that was in a state of spiritual coma. So that's the first stage, was your teachings and your methods will become known and revealed in the world. The next stage, that which I have taught you and you have grasped. In other words, what the prince got initially was just a few drops of powder and water. But the second stage is that they will be able to now grasp when they heal, when they become healed and become whole again. Then they will be able to grasp what I have taught you, the Baal Shem Tov. They'll be able to grasp things like the Baal Shem Tov has grasped things. What I have taught you and you have grasped, that they'll be able to get. That's the second stage. The third stage is they too, in other words, the people as well, the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, or the people in general, will also be able to do unifications and a sense of soul just like you. They will be able to unify things together, bring things together, and an ascent of soul, just like the Baal Shem Tov did. Now, when I talk about unifications, people immediately start thinking of, holy names intertwined. That is one method of unifications, the method of unification that the Arizal used and is still used today in Kabbalistic meditation and prayer. Those are called unifications, or yichudim in the original Hebrew, yichudim. However, that's not the only type of yichudim that we're talking about. Those are very powerful yichudim. What they do is they take spiritual forces which are encapsulated in certain holy names, and when those forces are combined, then they produce, so to speak, offspring. Just like unification of a male and a female will, in many cases, produce offspring, so too over here, the idea was that these holy names, when combined, these holy powers, when combined by certain meditations and prayers, will produce offspring as well. That's the unification of the type that is well known in Kabbalah and is done by the Arizal Rabbi Yitzhak Luria. Prior to him as well, but he is the one who promulgated many, many different forms and aspects and brand new examples of these kinds of unifications. However, there's another type of unification which to a certain extent is much more powerful even than that. And that is something that I heard from a person who is named, he's a Hasidic Rebbe, or was a Hasidic Rebbe, named the Makkah Rav. He was the Rabbi of Makkah. Makkah was a place somewhere in Eastern Europe, and probably in the Ukraine, maybe in Poland, but probably the Ukraine. And he once went to Fabrengen, he went to a Hasidic gathering in Brooklyn, where even though he himself was a Rebbe, he didn't have very many followers, but he himself would go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York. And one day he went there on the 10th of Kislev one year, and the Rebbe, the spiritual leader of Chabad, was talking about the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe, the birthday, or the birthday and the day of liberation of the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe was the second Chabad Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Lubavitch. The first one was Shnei Zalman Liyadi, who wrote the Tanya, and then his son was the second Rebbe, and he was imprisoned under false charges that he was conspiring against the government. He was simply sending money to Israel to support scholars that were living in Israel, and Israel at that time was under the authority of Turkey, and Turkey was at war with Russia, so he was kind of accused of, but eventually he was exonerated completely and was let go. And that happened on the 10th of Kislev. Anyway, the Rebbe was talking about, on the 10th of Kislev, was talking about the Mittler Rebbe. Our Rebbe, in other words, the Rebbe of this generation, was talking about the Rebbe of 6 generations before. And he was saying that the Mittler Rebbe, that Rebbe of 6 generations before, wanted his Hasidim, his disciples and followers, when they met together, to talk about Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tator. Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tator. Yehuda Ilah is the higher unity, Yehuda Tator the lower unity. In other words, how the world merges into divinity, into God, and how God is manifested in the world. Right? That's the higher Yehud. Yehud Ilah, the higher unification, is how the world dissolves into godliness. Completely becomes absorbed into godliness. That's the higher unity. The lower unity, how godliness is manifested in every aspect of creation, in every aspect of time. That's called the lower unity. That's what the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe said, that's what the Mittler Rebbe wanted his Hasidim to talk about. And what do I want my Hasidim to talk about when they stand on the street corner? I want them to talk about how to bring a third person closer to God. That is also called a unification. That's also Yichud Eloah and Yichud Taton. That's also the higher and lower unification. Bring another person closer to God is the higher unification. And that's done by two people getting together, the lower unification, and making it happen. Right? Making that happen. So the unifications don't necessarily have to be Kabbalistic in nature. They can be meditative in nature, the higher unity and the lower unity as explained by the Mittler Rebbe, and can also be the higher and lower unity explained by the Rebbe. Two people getting together to bring a third one closer to their divine soul. So that would be the third level, and then people will be able to make the same ascents of soul as you did. In other words, they'll be able to go to the highest levels of spirituality, travel, so to speak, to the highest levels of spirituality, and do whatever it is that one does at those places. Then finally, the fourth and final level will be then all the shells, in other words, all the levels of impurity, all the shells. They call impurity is called a shell because it sort of envelops reality and presents itself as something sort of impenetrable, so that the reality within cannot be experienced. It cannot be seen. It cannot be you cannot communicate with it because it's covered in this hard, tough shell. But through doing what it is that we do, the shells will be cracked apart, and not only will they be cracked apart, but they'll be completely destroyed. They'll be evaporated, basically. Yichlu kol ha-klippas. The klippas will not exist anymore. They will be completely nullified. And it will be an auspicious time and a time of salvation. In other words, that will be the time of the true Messianic redemption. In other words, a time when the soul will be redeemed from any connection with evil. It will only now have connection with good, with positive, with godliness, and not with anything that is the opposite of that. So that essentially was the manifesto. It became sort of the manifesto of the Baal Shem Tov, if you want to put it that way. Became his manifesto to make these things happen. But the way to make this happen is not that the Baal Shem Tov does it, but that we all take part in doing it. Because essentially, that's what the purpose is. The purpose is that we take part in it, not that someone else builds the building and we walk into it. We build the building and then it's ours. Just like the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the Holy Temple, was not just built by a special construction company or whatever it was built by the people. The people were involved in the building thereof. Everything was built by the entire people. Some people were good at setting stones, and some were good at decorating or weaving or whatever it may happen to be. So whatever thing that you were particularly good at, that's what you sort of gave in order to build the building. Now, we're not talking necessarily about building the building in a physical sense right now. We're building it only in a spiritual sense. We're building it up above, and eventually it will come down and manifest it in this world as a real building, as the Beit HaMikdash, as the temple. But what we're doing now is we're contributing, and we're contributing beyond ourselves. It's not something that we're doing in order to get something out of it. We're doing something in order that everybody will get everything out of it. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov's manifesto really was, to build a world, to build up the world that would be ultimately a vessel where godliness will be revealed. That's the time of salvation, when we'll be free completely of any self-seeking, of any evil seeking, of any evil influences, and so on and so forth. And that'll be the time of the what we call the Bias Mashiach, coming of the Mashiach, it'll be the Messianic Era. And the Baal Shem Tov then goes on to say to his brother-in-law that I was very disappointed to hear this, because it sounded to me like this is going to be a tremendously long and drawn out and difficult process, and how long can we wait for already? And therefore they taught him certain things, certain yichudim and certain teachings that he would be able to use, and he says, I can't share them with you right now, but these teachings are embedded within the teachings of Hasidus, within Hasidic teachings that he promulgated through his disciples, and eventually came down to us today in the form that we have it. So, to just conclude on a note of action, it's important that we get involved in learning, understanding, and spreading out the teachings as well. It's a well-known concept that if you know the alphabet and someone doesn't, someone else doesn't, even if it's only the alphabet, the aleph base that you know, that's all, right? You can teach the aleph base. You're qualified to teach what you know. And therefore, people should get involved in spreading out teachings as much as they're capable of, in order to make the world a better place for all of us, and a better place for ultimately a place that is God's garden, so to speak, which is what Gan Eden all really means. It's the garden of God. That's what it really is all about. Okay, so are there any questions?